Almost a month ago now, on September 8th, Queen Elizabeth II passed away at the age of 96. Though her death has obviously been anticipated, and I'm not just talking about by her son Charles, still the actual event was, to a certain extent, newsworthy. But the media has anything but been content to simply report on the death of a sweet lady who had already lived for nearly a century. They kept talking about it 24 hours a day, day after day. The homage shown by the media could almost make you forget that America fought a bloody revolutionary war to break free of the empire and the British monarchy. Broadcasters were literally grasping at straws for something else to say about the Queen's passing, sometimes drilling deep down into sordid personal details of the skeletons in the family closet and the sibling conflicts that go on among her grandchildren. They finally got down to speculating about what would become of her corgis. Flags flew at half-mast everywhere, including here in Springfield, from the day of her death until the day she was buried for over 2 weeks. Was there nothing going on in the news during all that time? Was talking about an admittedly nice lady who had lived her life in the public's eye, albeit lived it in unspeakable wealth, but still keeping a stiff upper lip in all circumstances, even though she did not actually have any governing or decision-making power in the government. Was this really news? It wasn't that much different from 25 years ago when in a single week, Princess Diana, Viktor Frankl, and Mother Teresa of Calcutta all died. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, published author, founder of logotherapy, was undoubtedly the most consequential of those three people. And Mother Teresa had certainly made a profound mark on the world through her charity work, but Princess Diana took up all of the time in the media. Mother Teresa was at least mentioned in passing, but I don't recall a single news story about Viktor Frankl, and only those of us who had been, speaking purely for myself, profoundly affected by his books, spoke to one another in reverential tones about his death. Diana's death in a tragic car accident was horrible. I'm not being dismissive about that or Queen Elizabeth's death. I'm just saying that a 24-hour news cycle ought to be able to tell us about the deaths of prominent or maybe famous people and still find lots of time to keep us informed about what's going on in the world. But they don't. When TV and radio were in their infancy, the government realized that the airways, the frequencies for broadcasting, had to be regulated, and that the airwaves were not the possession of corporations, they belonged to the people. So they put laws in place that required a certain percentage of their airtime to be devoted to informing the public. There was a fairness doctrine established in the 1940s that required that the news media not just be honest, but that they fairly represent both sides of a controversial topic. It was in the mid-1980s that Ronald Reagan had the fairness doctrine removed because it impeded him from using the media to spread lies and propaganda. I don't see any reason to sugarcoat that fact. Now, there have been some efforts at restoring the fairness doctrine's values, but they have all failed in light of how profitable propaganda has become for Fox News and other completely irresponsible and dishonest radio talk show hosts and other alleged news outlets that make a fortune out of just telling people completely fanciful lies. You might think that the public would not tolerate an irresponsible use of the media to misinform and keep people in the dark about facts, but you would be wrong. As Simone de Beauvoir said, the French existentialist philosopher and sometimes girlfriend of Jean-Paul Sartre, but who was not nearly as smart as Simone de Beauvoir, said, "The oppressor would not be so strong if he did not have accomplices among the oppressed." Sadly, people generally prefer to be entertained over being informed. So that for these corporate media to get away with not informing the public or misinforming the public or passing along ridiculous propaganda and conspiracy theories, they have to have the consent of those of us on the consumer end of things. So if we stopped accepting it, they would have to do better. And what passes for news in social media is even worse. I realize that Facebook tends to feed you more of what you clicked on last, but I can't be the only guy whose news feed has a lot more reports on scantily clad movie stars and models than it ever does on the war in Ukraine or the current state of our melting polar ice caps. And while it may be more interesting to see Elizabeth Banks in a wet white shirt or Summer Rae in a see-through black bodysuit, there has been no mention of some of the things that I have personally brought up in sermons about current events, like the Supreme Court giving Arizona permission to execute a prisoner even after he was found innocent, or a teenager that was swept up and locked into Guantanamo Bay and tortured for 14 years when they knew that he was innocent. Why do you get more news from a 20-minute sermon once a week than you get in a week's worth of 24/7 news reporting? Now, I'm not alleging some grand mind control conspiracy behind the major news networks, but the networks are all owned by corporations that are now doing their dead level best to make money on them. When I was a kid, the three major networks understood that their news bureau would be a money loser. But now, without the fairness doctrine, Fox, MSNBC, CNN, and Facebook, they just put out what their audiences are most likely to consume. They have evaluated their audiences and they give us what they think we want. There are things they will tell you to keep you entertained, but there are also things they will not tell you that might negatively affect their bottom line. Now, I have a great deal of personal experience in this arena. For more than 20 years, I had a column in our local city newspaper, and at least once a year, their new editor, because they move them around a lot, would call me in for a come to Jesus meeting. I was not on their paid staff. I wrote because I wanted to raise important issues with my readers. They were paid, and they kept their jobs by selling advertising and subscriptions. So we were at cross purposes. Gannett moves their editors and publishers around pretty often, and I eventually had to deliver a speech to every single one of them that my column was the most read column in their paper, usually 10 to 20 times as many readers as their full-time staff writers got. Of course, I'm also sure that they got more complaints from advertisers about me than they did any other writer. I personally had a number of angry readers who evidently never missed a column because I heard from them every week. They hated me and couldn't wait to get the next column. One memorable conflict was when they had asked me to write more columns on matters of local interest. So I put a lot of time and energy into a piece about how the board members of our largest regional hospital did millions of dollars of business with the hospital every year on unbid contracts. That is, the people that were supplying the hospital with all of their supplies and equipment never had to put out a competitive bid. They just paid their board members millions of dollars. And the board members, who were becoming nasty rich off of their hospital contracts, returned the favor by giving the administrator of the hospital bonuses that added up to more than $1 million a year. They could do this because they charged their patients exorbitant prices and even took the homes of many people who did not keep their bills current. This is not a homestead state. So a hospital could literally take your home if you don't pay their inflated medical bills. So I thought I did a good job of investigative reporting, right? That's a local story. It's relevant. People would want to know about it. Still, when I got called in for my next meeting, I thought my red-faced editor was going to come across the boardroom table and choke me. They didn't publish the article, even though I gave them copies of the IRS 990 nonprofit documents to prove that everything I said was true. But the hospitals themselves provide about 25% of the advertising dollars paid to the newspaper, and the newspaper knew that they didn't take out ads just to get new patients. Which one of us has read an ad about an oncology group and decided to go get cancer surgery? The hospitals buy ads to prevent negative news coverage, and it works. The universities are the largest employers in our city. The hospitals are second. And even though I served on boards where I saw a lot of the really corrupt dealings of both, I never succeeded in getting a single article that was critical of either one of them into print. I could write about national and international events without any problems, but there are sacred cows here in town that my editor would not let me touch. I did a lot of international stuff. I even got threatening phone calls from the Polish embassy after one of my pieces where I mentioned the well-documented fact that there were a lot of Nazi sympathizers in Poland during the Holocaust, but let's not rehash that now. The point is, as Noam Chomsky says so clearly in his book, How the World Works, the media will cover certain allowed topics, but they will do it in a narrow way, and they will allow even very vigorous debate within that narrow corridor, which gives the impression that the public is really being invited to speak to these matters of great importance, while the most important issues are never illuminated. I've often observed that MSNBC's Morning Joe program typically invites some of the world's most intelligent people onto their set every morning, and then they don't let them talk. Strict guidelines are given to the staff and the guests about what they can and cannot say. Just ask some of the people that they have fired over the past decade. While we are treated to days of watching long lines of slow-moving cars carrying the late monarch's casket, all while that's going on, did you know, for example, that there's only about 10 corporations that own 80% of the edible food products sold in the United States? That only 15 cents on the dollar spent in a grocery store actually goes to the farmers who produce the food. That Pepsi doesn't just own a soft drink company, they also own most of the potato chip and dip companies that you consume with your Pepsi. You don't read newspaper articles about food additives, preservatives, and fillers, or the fact that one of the main ingredients in Taco Bell meat is actually sand. Taco Bell calls it a binder, but it is quartz, it's sand. But you do know which members of the royal family like little girls and which ones carry the deepest racial prejudices. Reporting on Prince Andrew's sex crimes seems like bold reporting. It seems to have a certain amount of courage, even though it's just salacious and attention-getting. They will not tell you why the number of beds for homeless people in this city has been cut by 80% over the past decade. And even I don't know why. I just know that it's happened, and I've been trying to find out for years. Somehow, city leaders have been able to reduce our homeless services to a tiny symbol of what we used to do, and there has never been an explanation. You virtually never read any investigative reporting about the city's poverty programs because the poor are powerless, and the powerful don't want you to ask questions about the root causes of poverty because the root causes of poverty are exactly the same as the root causes of them being rich and powerful. As Fyodor Dostoevsky said, the best way to keep a prisoner from escaping is to make sure that he never knows that he is a prisoner. In other Western democracies, it's generally illegal to lie to the public when the intent is to misinform or mislead. In the United States, it's not only legal, it's one of the most profitable industries out there. While the media looked for something else to say about the late monarch, you did not hear them even bring up the connection between the British monarchy to a long history of empire and cruel economic colonialism. How did the monarchy come to own billions in property and the late Queen's personal estate, her personal wealth, is right at $20 billion with a B dollars, and her heirs will pay no inheritance tax as that wealth is passed from one generation to the next? Can we even mention that there is a direct line from the poverty in India and Pakistan, in Honduras, in Belize, and Jamaica to the estate of the late Queen? Or do you even want to know? I'm not opposed to saying a lot of nice things about the Queen on the week of her death, but in their endless coverage, could they not find a moment to mention some of the hard reality of the abuses of the British monarchy? I realize that a lot of comfortable white people don't want to hear anything about the downside of the British monarchy, but I tell you, I've got some friends in Central America who will explain to you why they are still poor in Central America, and they will go into it in great detail. And could there be a relationship between the fact that I keep bringing things like this up to the fact that I no longer have a weekly column in the local paper? I will tell you what I said to my editor in our last heated meeting. Journalism happens when you write something that someone doesn't want you to write. Everything else is just advertising and entertainment. If the news media won't do it, shouldn't the church at least try to be a reliable voice of the truth? Shouldn't prophetic preaching speak truth to power? And if it doesn't, what is it for? Oh, and just so you won't worry about them, Prince Andrew agreed to take the corgis. I hope they bite him.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.